This is Oldham. The town resides on the border between Lancashire and Yorkshire and is today a part of Greater Manchester. Waterhead lies on its easternmost extremity. Waterhead still retains an air of slight separation, although in truth is now almost encircled by other districts of Oldham. The earliest known mention of Waterhead was Watergate Mill in 1648. It's also mentioned in a document dated 1654 that mentions Watercorn Mill, commonly called Watergate Mill. Here the suffixes head and gate were used interchangeably to mean a mill race. Until 1625, the village was surrounded with open moorland that was farmed in common. It was also a source of peat for fuel, as remembered in the name of nearby Lower Turf Lane. Enclosure to form settled fields resulted in a pattern of large, regular strips of land that can still be made out when looking from the steep road through Waterhead leading to Austerlands. 2 centuries ago, the dominant sources of income in the village were the inevitable cottage industries and coal. Small-scale animal husbandry also played a part. Being too poor for agriculture, the land between Oldham and Waterhead was cheap, and therefore ideal for industrial entrepreneurs when the Industrial Revolution reached this part of Lancashire. Like many northern towns, Oldham grew fast. Waterhead, indeed the whole of the Oldham area, soon experienced extensive industrialised growth from the late 18th century into the early years of the 20th. Industrial growth necessitated a large influx of workers, some skilled, but most semi-skilled at best. We can guess that a large proportion were illiterate because one of the common priorities for all the Victorian churches in Oldham was teaching the rudiments of literacy. This sudden growth in population brought other problems, such as lawlessness, drunkenness. Perhaps that's why many local people felt that Waterhead needed its own local, established church. It was therefore possibly a relief when the London Gazette for Tuesday the 3rd of December 1844 bore this pronouncement. At the Court of Windsor, the 28th day of November 1844, present, the Queen's most excellent Majesty in council. It then set out the legal apparatus for splitting the new parish of Oldham into 5 separate districts, and one of these was Waterhead. The people of Waterhead now had permission to found a new church. All they needed was an energetic visionary for a vicar. They needed land. They needed a good architect. They needed money. And they succeeded in every possible way. Within a few months of the Queen's order in council, the Diocese of Chester, not Manchester yet, appointed Waterhead's first incumbent. He was the Reverend Patrick Reynolds. His task was colossal, for the new parish was vast in area, scope, and in its many needs. Reynolds styled himself perpetual curate of Waterhead. This archaic phrase was in common use during the first half of the 19th century. It meant an incumbent who had no right to supplement his income from, for example, tithes, glebe, or other ancient endowments. The living at Waterhead was just such a perpetual curacy. Reynolds' salary was relatively high at £150 per annum, but it wasn't high for Oldham, for the town was already one of the industrial powerhouses of the fast-growing British Empire. Indeed, it was one of the wealthiest towns in the world. Reynolds found lodgings at a local farm and made friends with the local surgeon, Dr. Abraham Leach. At this time there was no church building, so together they inspected local buildings that might accommodate a Sunday school for the children and a place of worship for adults. Eventually they found a room above 2 local cottages located in the Grove, a row of dwellings off Sidebottom Street. This image was taken in 1903, not long before they were demolished. The first congregation comprised Miss Beswick and half a dozen children. These first worshippers, including the new vicar, nicknamed the site the old cathedral. Incidentally, the grove had been occupied previously until 1837 by members of the Congregational Church movement, when the Reverend Galland, who was pastor of Griniker's Church, conducted Sunday evening services there until his death in 1834. The Reverend Galland himself is still remembered to this day because he gave his name to the church on which one of Oldham's last remaining Congregational churches still resides. The current church on Galland Street was built in 1854. It's quite likely that Reynolds' achievement in building the nearby Waterhead Church spurred the Congregationalists to upgrade their own church building. Reynolds set to work. He met with a great deal of apathy from many local people and open hostility from quite a few, but his enthusiasm and energy meant that numbers soon grew. They grew fast. Reynolds didn't want to lead classes in an upper room, though. He wanted to build and lead a new church. First, he needed land. The land on which today's church is built was formerly in the ownership of the Lord of the Manor of Ashton, but had converted to cotton spinning in about 1800 when it acquired the name of Lower Mill. 4 years before the founding of the church, the land changed hands once more. It passed to Mr. A.R. Sidebottom of Lincoln's Inn in London. Sidebottom was a God-fearing man, and he gave the land to Reynolds for the new church. Reynolds could now begin to plan the actual building work. The church committee sought the services of a young Manchester architect, Edwin Hugh Shellard. We don't know how Waterhead Church Committee came to know of him, for he was still a young man at this time, but he had already designed several new churches in Lancashire and in the Manchester area. In consequence, he was well regarded. Perhaps more importantly, Shellard had been the architect of St. Peter's Church in Blakely, only a few miles from Oldham, and Reynolds had been a curate there, straight before his promotion to the living at Waterhead. Indeed, the church in Blakely was started the year before Reynolds came to Waterhead. It seems impossible not to suggest they knew each other before Waterhead Church was even a dream. Behind our guesswork about their relationship, Shellard was commissioned to design a church of similar size, similar style and proportion to the one Reynolds had seen the birth of in Blakely. And thankfully Shellard accepted. His fee? £128.07. Reynolds now had the land on which to build, and he had a good architect whom he knew and trusted. Next, he assembled a small committee led by his new friend Dr. Leach. On the 13th of September 1845, they felt confident enough to issue a competitive tender for the church. A small advert in the Advertiser said, "To builders and others. Parties desirous of constructing for the performance of the whole or any portion of the work required to be done in the erection of a new church at Waterhead Mill, near Oldham." They were clearly confident, for they added, "The committee do not pledge themselves to accept the lowest tender." All this time Reynolds was seeking sufficient money to start building the new church. Amazingly, the first stone was laid within 3 months of his arrival, on the 9th of March 1845. The eventual cost was an eye-watering £3,780, 5 shillings and 6pence. In today's money, that's almost £4 million. When completed, the building was dedicated to the Holy and Undivided Trinity, and it was consecrated on Trinity Sunday in the 5th of July 1847. The legal expenses to consecrate the new church cost the then huge sum of £5. Look at this amazing document. This document here is the so-called Deed of Consecration. It was signed by the consecrating bishop, Dr. John Bird Sumner. That's why his name dominates the top of this document. Incidentally, this fine calligraphy cost a further fortune. Shellard's new church was now built, and had been completed in near record time. But that's not the end of the story. Rather, it's the beginning of the next part of the story. the life of Waterhead Church. There were many opportunities ahead, but also many needs. It would wait a mere fortnight before its first wedding service, a few weeks more for a mechanical means of creating music, 3 months before the first burial in the spacious church grounds. They would wait 10 years for a vicarage for Reynolds' successor, 21 years before the church was first lit by gas, 60 years before it had electricity, and the church had to wait fully 169 years before it had running water. But for now, the village of Waterhead had its own new state-of-the-art parish church, and it was stunning.